Hello again, beautiful best friends. Lily's come to say hi as well. Welcome back to our safe, cozy space of the big wide internet. It's so good to see you again and so soon. I hope you're all doing super well. And thank you for joining me for part 2 of the little chat we were having earlier. All of us, including Lily. Yes, you were here too. If you're new here, then hi, my name is Liz and I'm so happy that you're here, as is my co-host Lily. She's here for emotional support, which we generally always need. But as I said before, this is part 2 of our coverage of the BOWRAVILLE Murders case. And so if you haven't seen part 1, then you can click on one of the corners up here. I can never for the life of me remember which corner it pops up on, but definitely click on part 1 or you are going to spend the next hour of your life just completely confused. And me and Lily don't want that for you, right? Right. So when we left off in part 1, there had been no less than 3 children from the same small town in New South Wales called BOWRAVILLE murdered or presumed murdered within the last 5 months. And the police, who at first basically ignored the children's disappearance and then targeted the families themselves in their investigation, had finally cottoned on that the children had actually been the victims of a serial killer targeting Indigenous children living on the mission. And now with a 28-year-old Jay Hart behind bars awaiting trial for the murder of 16-year-old Clinton Speedy-Duroux, now they just needed to link Jay to the disappearance of 16-year-old Colleen Walker-Craig and the murder of the 4-year-old Evelyn Greenup. And spoiler alert, they found this to be a surprisingly easy task just by going through the witness accounts of the nights that the children had disappeared, because not only had Jay been present at the party where Clinton disappeared, but he had been present at the party where Colleen had disappeared from, and the party where Evelyn had disappeared from. Like the dots are just connecting themselves for police at this point, right? So let's go back to the night that Colleen disappeared. Police spoke with multiple people that had seen Colleen at the party that night, just chatting with friends and drinking, but multiple people told police that they had also seen Colleen speaking with Jay that night, or more so Jay pestering Colleen and making advances at her and trying to convince the 16-year-old girl to come back to his caravan with him to have some more drinks and watch some music videos. Something that should sound pretty familiar at this point, because the promise of alcohol and music videos was exactly how Jay got Clinton and his girlfriend Kelly Jarrett to come back to his caravan the night that Clinton disappeared. But what's really worth knowing here is that this offer was also familiar to Colleen herself. This wasn't the first time that Jay had used this method to coax her back to his caravan. Just a few months earlier in July, Colleen and a friend had taken Jay up on what he promised was a totally non-sexual offer for them to come to his caravan for free booze and music videos. Colleen had later told her mother, Muriel, that the arrangement that night had been for her and her friend to sleep in the double bed in the caravan, while Jay would sleep on the fold-out dining table, which he often used as a spare bed for himself. But later that night, after everyone had fallen asleep, Colleen woke up extremely groggy and drowsy to Jay attempting to climb into her side of the bed while touching her and attempting to remove her clothes. And Colleen told her mum that despite her almost like anesthetized state, she had managed to fight Jay off. And the next morning when the girls had woken up, Jay was nowhere to be seen. But Colleen did have to put her shorts back on, which had been removed at some point during the night. And trust me, just definitely bookmark that for later. Colleen had actually stayed in Jay's caravan another night after this time bringing a male friend, and nothing sus had happened. But the night that Colleen had disappeared, Jay was back at it again, trying to convince her to come and stay in his caravan. But as you might remember from part 1, Colleen had plans that night. She was going to leave the party at midnight with a group of friends and catch a train to another town. And according to the eyewitness account from another partygoer, Colleen was last seen at midnight walking away from a group of friends that she had been chatting with and drinking with under a tree and heading down an alleyway on the side of the house where the party was taking place. And this same eyewitness said that at the exact same time that they saw Colleen walking down this alleyway towards the back of the house, they saw Jay walking down the other side of the house in the exact same direction to where conveniently his car was parked. So just to summarize, the very last time that Colleen was seen alive, she was walking in the exact same direction as the man that not only had shown frankly disturbing interest in this 16-year-old girl, but on one occasion had at least attempted to sexually assault her. But moving on, let's talk about the night that 4-year-old Evelyn Greenup disappeared just 3 weeks later. As you'll remember, there had also been a party that night, a big one, and Jay was there, as usual, with his generous supply of alcohol and marijuana. But that night, after the party had wound up and Rebecca had taken Evelyn and the boys to bed to sleep, Patricia specifically had to ask Jay to leave at 2:30 a.m. after she caught him outside looking into the windows of her house. Like pretty much everyone from the party has gone home and Jay is still there peeking into the windows. Patricia then went to bed, but she woke up shortly later because she heard Evelyn crying. And Patricia said in an interview that this cry from Evelyn, it wasn't a cry that she had ever heard from the little girl before. And so Patricia went to investigate, but when she tried to get into the room where Rebecca, Evelyn, and the boys were sleeping, she couldn't get the door open. And so while she was still outside trying to get in, she heard a thud and then Evelyn went quiet. And so assuming that Rebecca had managed to soothe Evelyn, Patricia then went back to bed again. Now, to be fair, I believe Patricia never told police about hearing this cry and then a thud, even though she was interviewed multiple times, probably for the same reason that a lot of other witnesses didn't really come forward. They were distrustful of the police and felt that they wouldn't be believed. But Patricia wasn't the only one that saw Jay at the house that night long after the party had ended. Fiona Duckett, who was staying overnight at the house after the party, would later testify in court that when she got up at about 3:30 a.m. to prepare a bottle for her child, she saw Jay leaving the room where Rebecca, Evelyn, and the boys were sleeping. Fiona said that Jay made a beeline for the front door and he was walking so fast, almost running, to the point where she followed him, wondering what he was up to, but she had lost sight of him by the time she got to the front door and looked into the front yard. The next time Jay's movements could be traced was when he returned to the house the following morning to grab his boombox. And at this point, Rebecca was already out searching for Evelyn, but Jay told Patricia that he had stayed on her couch in the living room the night before, even though none of the other partygoers who had also spent the night in the living room could remember ever seeing him there. But now, with all of these interviews that the police were finally conducting, they could now place Jay at the scene of all three disappearances. And not only that, but they believed that they had a pretty firm grasp on what the motives had been behind the murders. If you've been paying particularly close notice, you might have noticed a disturbing trend of the women involved in this case sleeping very heavily and then waking up extremely groggy or hungover or disoriented. And I can tell you now that you are not crazy. You have not been imagining that trend. During their investigation, police would hear multiple stories of Indigenous women and girls from the mission having these experiences where they would be in Jay's company at a party or at his caravan afterwards, where he would ply them with alcohol and marijuana. And then the following morning, not only would they wake up like groggy and disoriented with no real recollection of the night before, but they would find that their pants had been pulled down during the night and they had no idea when or how that had happened. Police were also told that as well as booze and weed, Jay always seemed to have a supply of medication on him. And he always said that these pills were for heartburn and indigestion, but there were people that believed that that's not what these pills were at all. They believed that these pills were some kind of sedative that Jay would use to spike these women's drinks when they declined his advances so that he could sexually assault them. So remember me telling you to bookmark that time that Jay had attempted to sexually assault Colleen in his caravan and she had woken up the following morning with no pants on? Well, Evelyn's mother, Rebecca, had a similar experience the morning that she woke up and realized that Evelyn had disappeared. That morning, not only was Rebecca extremely hungover and groggy, but she found that her underpants and jeans had been pulled down and were around her ankles, and she had no memory of when or how that had happened. And then there was Kelly Jarrett, Clinton's girlfriend, girlfriend who was in Jay's caravan with Clinton the night he disappeared. Kelly, it turned out, was already wary of Jay. Maybe she had heard stories like the ones we're talking about now, but she actually told Clinton before she fell asleep that night to make sure that he didn't leave her alone with Jay. And when she awoke the following morning, again extremely groggy and drowsy, and saw no sign of Jay or Clinton anywhere in the caravan, she also found that her shorts and underwear had been removed during the night, and she found them on the floor of the caravan close to where she found Clinton's shoes. So taking all of this into account, police now not only believed that Jay was a serial killer, but also that he was a serial sexual predator, and that two of the killings themselves had actually been a collateral byproduct of his sexual attacks. They believed that Colleen herself had been murdered after Jay had sexually assaulted her, but that Evelyn had been murdered when she had witnessed or gotten in the way of a sexual attack on her mother, Rebecca, and that Clinton had been murdered for potentially trying to protect Kelly, his girlfriend, when Jay had attempted to sexually assault her. And so on the 16th of October 1991, when Jay was already behind bars awaiting trial for Clinton's murder, he was also charged with Evelyn's murder. At the time, although there was plenty of reason to believe that Colleen was dead and had also been murdered by Jay, there was simply no physical evidence whatsoever to connect Jay to Colleen's disappearance. And with no body, it was felt that there was no way that a murder conviction would be attainable in Colleen's case. But for now, the families of Colleen and Evelyn and Clinton were hopeful that they were finally going to see justice for their children, because they felt that looking at all three cases together, there was just no way that anyone could deny that all three children were killed by the same perpetrator, and that perpetrator had been Jay Hart. Unfortunately, Justice Badgery Parker of the New South Wales Supreme Court did not feel this way though. And so on the 25th of August 1993, he agreed with Jay's defense lawyer's argument that it would be, quote, so seriously and unjustly prejudiced as to make it impossible for Jay to get a fair trial if he were tried for both Clinton and Evelyn's murders at the same time. And this decision right here is one that has haunted the case ever since, and it just makes no sense. Basically, according to the New South Wales Supreme Court, there was no reason not to believe that three separate perpetrators had all gone to the same street in the same small New South Wales country town within 5 months of each other and abducted three children. And then these three separate perpetrators had killed at least two of these children in almost identical ways. And then these three separate perpetrators had disposed of two of the children's bodies and the clothes of a third, all within a handful of kilometers of each other. Like, please make it make sense. This is something that had never occurred in Australia's history. You know, three children being abducted and murdered in the same small country town, all within 5 months of each other, and it not being the work of a single person, a serial killer. And the only way for a jury to know how ridiculous this idea was for them to hear about all three cases in the same trial. But now the juries from Clinton and Evelyn's trials weren't even going to be made aware of the other murders at all. But the families were still hopeful at this point, telling themselves that everything was fine. They just needed to get Jay on one, and surely the others would follow. And it was decided that Jay would be tried for Clinton's murder first, because Clinton's murder was the only case that the Crown prosecutor had any physical evidence to present against Jay. Jay Hart pled not guilty at his trial, which took place in February 1994 in Grafton, New South Wales. And the physical evidence, namely the pillowcase from Jay's caravan that had been found stuffed down the front of Clinton's shorts, was quite undeniably the Crown's strongest evidence against Jay. At the trial, Jay took the stand in his own defense. And I mentioned in part one that his story regarding his movements on the morning that Clinton disappeared didn't add up to police before he was arrested. And honestly, it still didn't make sense on the stand. But here's how Jay's morning played out that day. According to Jay, Jay testified that after falling asleep very drunk at about 3:30 a.m. in the caravan with Clinton and Kelly after the party, his alarm for work went off just a couple of hours later at 5:15 a.m. because he had work at 6 a.m. at the tanning factory. Still drunk though, Jay hit the snooze button, but he was still awake enough to hear someone leave the caravan shortly after the alarm went off, presumably Clinton. At about 5:45 a.m., Jay said that he finally got up out of bed and left the caravan to go to the house on the same property where his mum, Marlene Hart, lived, and convinced her to give him her car keys because he thought he had missed his ride from his co-worker who usually picked him up a few minutes before 6. This part of Jay's story, by the way, is completely at odds with what Marlene Hart, Jay's mum, and her boyfriend at the time, Noel Short, told police in their initial interviews. Noel told police that he left work at 4:45 a.m. and noticed that all the lights in the caravan were on at a time when, according to Jay, everyone in the caravan was supposed to be asleep. And Jay's mum, Marlene, told officers in her original interview that she would usually leave her keys in her handbag at the foot of her bed, meaning that there would be no reason for Jay to wake her and convince her to give him the car keys. He could have just slipped in there and grabbed them. However, by the time Jay's trial rolled around in 1994, Marlene's story had changed. She now said that she kept her keys in her pillowcase, like under her head as she slept. So she was now confirming Jay's story that he had woken her up at about 5:50 a.m. to ask her for her keys. Interestingly, Marlene had also changed her story about the blankets that Jay would use in the caravan, which, according to her first statement, she said had matched the one found near Clinton's body. But now she said that police had inserted that part of her statement into the record and that she had never actually said that. Anyway, back to Jay's testimony on the stand, he said that he was stressed about being late for work, and so he got into his mum's car, a reddy orange Galant, and he started towards work, but on his way, he saw his mate, the one that usually picked him up for work, driving back towards the caravan. And this is where it really starts to not add up, because Jay said that he turned back around and drove to the caravan and sent his friend off to work, but he himself chose to stay back for a cup of tea, even though he had been super stressed about being late for work just a few minutes earlier. Jay did eventually make it to work at about 6:20 a.m., reportedly still visibly drunk, and he was there for a couple of hours before he headed back home to give Marlene her car back because she needed to take her 7-year-old son to school. And it was at this point, about 8:30 a.m., when Kelly awoke in the caravan to the sound of Jay's voice and realized that Clinton was missing. The Crown pointed out that Jay's testimony conflicted directly with a neighbor's statement to police that she had seen Marlene's car, the reddy orangey Galant, leave the property not at 6 a.m. when Jay said that he had originally left the first time for work, but at 4:50 a.m. And this brings us to how the Crown contended things really went down. The Crown accused Jay of spiking Kelly's drink that night and then making an attempt to sexually assault her. And they said that Clinton potentially woke up during this attack and attempted to fight Jay off. And in the struggle that followed, Jay murdered Clinton and then pushed the pillowcase down Clinton's shorts because he had urinated after he had died, which I think most people will be aware is a common occurrence after death. The Crown said that Jay had then taken his mum's keys for her car, which, as we said, she originally told police she left at the foot of her bed, and then put Clinton's body in the car and left the property to dispose of Clinton's body at 4:50 a.m., the time that the neighbor told the police she saw the car leaving the property. The Crown said that Jay then returned to his caravan in his mum's car at 6 a.m. like he claimed and his co-worker confirmed, but this wasn't from Jay heading to work and then turning back. It was him returning from dumping Clinton's body alongside Congarini Road. Everything at this trial, though, really came down to the witness testimonies, and Jay's defense dragged Kelly, Clinton's girlfriend, over the coals on the stand because she had been been admittedly intoxicated the night before Clinton went missing, and there was no way to prove that Jay had spiked her drink. And they did the same with the other witnesses from the party that night, saying that their accounts of Jay's behavior that night also couldn't be trusted because they had been at a drinking party. And then there were the witnesses that I mentioned in part 1 that claimed to have seen Clinton hitchhiking out of Bowraville the morning after he was supposed to have been murdered in the caravan, which we know doesn't make any sense. I mean, Clinton and Kelly were inseparable by this point. Kelly had specifically asked Clinton not to leave her alone with Jay before they fell asleep. And as we know, Clinton would have never left behind his prized shoes in the caravan. These testimonies about Clinton hitchhiking out of town that morning also didn't make sense together. One witness said that they had seen Clinton at 4:50 a.m. that morning in this one specific spot on the road heading out of town. And the other witness testified that they had seen someone that could have been Clinton. Yes, they never actually confirmed that it was Clinton. Anyway, they saw him at that exact same spot over an hour later at 6:20. But all the same, it's believed that it's specifically these supposed sightings of Clinton hitchhiking that led to Jay being acquitted of his murder on the 18th of February, 1994, exactly 3 years to the day since Clinton's remains had been found dumped alongside the road. And Clinton's family and the other victims' families, of course, were beyond devastated. And this was something that the police had obviously anticipated when they decided to have a riot squad present at the verdict reading, something that was not usual protocol. But there were so many riot police in the courtroom that day that it was standing room only. This riot squad was not required, even though the family was obviously devastated in the outcome of the trial. They showed incredible dignity and restraint in how they handled the verdict, which was probably disappointing to the media, who had been mostly absent for the rest of the trial, but now showed up in droves, shoving cameras and microphones in the family's face, asking questions like, "Do you think you'll ever get over it?" And even going so far as to climb the side of the building to try and get shots through the windows of the courthouse of the family as they tried to process what had just happened. And it just got more heartbreaking and infuriating from there, because the Crown, the prosecutors, who had decided to try Jay first with Clinton's murder because it was the only case where they felt they had enough physical evidence to prove Jay guilty, now that Jay had been found not guilty, they made the decision to no-bill the charge against him for Evelyn's murder, meaning that Jay was now a free man, found innocent in the court of law. And I think a lot of people thought that this would be the end of it, but the families of the victims understandably and rightfully refused to accept this as the closing of the case of their murdered children. And in late 1996, as a result of their outcry, there was a strike force created to reinvestigate the murders of Colleen, Evelyn, and Clinton. And the strike force was primarily headed up by none other than Detective Sergeant Gary Jublin, who is a big name in Australian law enforcement, having been part of some very high-profile cases, including both the search for William Tyrrell and the investigation into the death of Matthew Levison. But of course, we're going back to 1996, 25 years ago, and even though Gary Jublin had 10 plus years of homicide investigation under his belt, he said that when he arrived in Bowraville, he was basically a big city homicide detective brought into an environment that he was unaccustomed to. It sounds like coming into this reinvestigation, he realized he had a lot to learn, because when the families of Colleen, Evelyn, and Clinton told him that the reason their children's murders were still unsolved was that they were Aboriginal children, Gary says that he didn't believe them at first. That being said, it's safe to assume that by the time an inquest into all three children's murders took place in 2014, Gary's feelings had definitely changed. At the inquiry, Gary's statement to the committee read in part, "It is difficult to imagine how the families must feel having no faith or trust in the authorities who are there to protect them, whilst at the same time knowing the authorities are the only people that can help them get justice and closure. I have been asked so often by the families whether this matter would be handled the same way if it were three white children from a wealthy suburb in Sydney who were murdered. I cannot with a clear conscience say it would be, this is an uncomfortable truth, which I feel should be accepted. Fortunately, though, when putting this strike force together in 1997, the New South Wales Police seemed to have the best intentions in doing things differently this time. And so the strike force was made up from detectives not from child protection this time, but from homicide and major crimes. There were also no local police from Bowraville on the strike force. Everyone was brought in from out of town. The detectives were also given cultural awareness and sensitivity training, and they understood the mistrust that the Indigenous residents of the mission had towards law enforcement, something that had caused a lot of strife and friction in the original investigation. But by treating these family members and witnesses with respect and being open and honest with them and not pressuring them, Gary and the rest of the team were able to gain a little bit of trust from the community. And as a result, people were more willing to speak with them. And while the strike force detectives did originally go in treating each case as separate, over the months they came to the same conclusion as the police had in the original investigation, that all three children had been murdered by the same person, a serial killer, and that all roads led back to that killer being Jay Hart. One woman told the detectives that one night in the weeks between Colleen's disappearance and Evelyn's disappearance, she had awoken in the middle of the night to Jay standing at the foot of her bed, as in he had entered her home in the middle of the night, uninvited and unannounced, and entered her bedroom with God knows what intentions in mind. And luckily, it sounds like when Jay realized she was awake, he just fled. But when the detectives asked this woman why she didn't tell the police in the original investigation in 1990, she told them that she felt that she wouldn't be believed. An Indigenous woman saying that a white man had broken into her house in the middle of the night. As well as speaking with new witnesses, of course, a big part of the reinvestigation was going over all of the old witness accounts from the original investigation. And in doing so, the strike force detectives came across a massive lead in the form of an eyewitness account that absolutely should have been heard in court at Clinton's murder trial, but instead the Crown prosecutors had never even been aware that it existed because the police who took the statement in the original investigation never even bothered following it up. Yes, they never even followed it up. But we're not surprised at this point, right? This eyewitness account later became known as the Norco Corner evidence because back in 1991, following news breaking that Clinton had gone missing, 2 delivery drivers reported to police that in the early hours of the morning where Clinton disappeared, they were passing a corner known as Norco Corner, just about 200 meters from where Jay lived in his caravan. And the drivers told police that when they had turned this corner at 5 a.m. that morning, they had seen a young Aboriginal male unconscious and barefooted laying in the middle of the road, like they very nearly ran him over. And so naturally they pulled over to suss out what was going on and if he was okay. But they didn't even get the chance before they were approached by a tall, stocky white man who basically very assuredly told them not to worry, that he'd already called the police and that an ambulance was on the way. Basically like, don't worry, I've got this covered, and really keen for them to kind of move on. So reluctantly, the drivers did pull off, but as they did, they noticed a red/orange car pulled over on the side of the road with its trunk wide open. One of the drivers, Michael Scafidi, said in an interview that he recognized the man that he had seen looming over the Aboriginal male when he saw the man again, this time years later, on an investigative program where the man had been kind of ambushed by a camera crew and a journalist asking him if he had killed those 3 children back in Bowraville. Yeah, it was Jay Hart. And no one knows why the police in the original investigation never followed up on this statement or re-interviewed the drivers before the trial for Clinton's murder, because this would have been very compelling evidence against Jay, especially alongside the neighbor's testimony that she had seen Jay's mother's reddy orangey car leave the property just before these drivers saw a red-orange car pulled over on the side of the road where this young boy was laying. The theory that the strike force formed was that after Jay had murdered Clinton, he put Clinton's body in his mother's car and drove to Norco Corner, where he placed Clinton's body in the middle of the road, hoping that he would be run over and it would look like an accident and not a murder. When the delivery drivers pulled over instead, though, Jay realized that this plan wasn't going to work, and so he put Clinton's body back into his mum's car and then dumped his body alongside Congarini Road just outside of town. And the strike force included the Norco Corner evidence along with all of the other leads they had pointing directly at Jay in their final report submitted to the DPP, or the Director of Public Prosecutions, in March 1998, with their recommendation being that charges be reinstated against Jay and the proceedings begin to try him for Evelyn's murder. A year after this report was submitted, the DPP declined the recommendation to press charges against Jay. However, they changed their mind after a coronial inquest in 2004 into the deaths of Colleen and Evelyn, during which one of Jay's former fellow inmates, known only as Witness X, took the stand and testified that Jay had confided in him while awaiting trial. Firstly, essentially that Clinton had pulled a knife on Jay, that Jay had then overpowered Clinton and then hit him in the head, and then wrapped his body in a blanket and dumped his body in a marijuana patch. And secondly, when it came to Evelyn, Jay told him he had gotten really angry and banged her head against a wall. Jay was now 40 years old and once again pled not guilty at his trial for the murder of 4-year-old Evelyn, which commenced on the 7th of February 2006 at the Port Macquarie Supreme Court. And it was decided once again that the jury were not going to be allowed to hear evidence from the other murders, from Colleen's murder and Clinton's murder, in this trial. This makes no sense when you look at the coroner's findings from the 2004 inquiry. Coincidentally, the only time that a judicial officer has ever heard evidence from all 3 murders at the same time. After 4 weeks of hearing evidence from all 3 murders, the coroner, the New South Wales coroner, Mr. James Abernathy, stated in his findings, and I quote, "Like the investigating police, I am of the opinion that the circumstances surrounding the disappearance of Colleen Walker and the murders of Evelyn Greenup and Clinton Speedy have strikingly similar characteristics. The coincidence and tendency evidence suggests that blank was involved in the disappearance." Unquote. And just so you know, blank is where the person's name was redacted, but we all know now that he's talking about Jay Hart. The coroner then went on to detail no less than 11 similarities between all 3 cases that had led him to this conclusion. And yet the decision was made all the same that evidence from Colleen and Clinton's cases would not be heard at the trial for Evelyn's murder. And it still gets worse because the 4 other inmates that all alleged that Jay had confessed to them while awaiting trial were also not going to be allowed to testify. And of course, there was 0 physical evidence to present against Jay in trial because the scene where Evelyn had disappeared from had never been secured or treated as a crime scene or forensically tested. So this all probably gives us a bit of insight into the Crown prosecutor's state of mind when they told Detective Gary Jubilin going into the trial that there was no way they were going to win. Exactly what you want to hear from a prosecutor before the trial even starts. But at the same time, I kind of get it. Like, talk about an uphill battle. This whole trial once again came down to the witness testimonies, and there were witnesses that were able to place Jay at the party the night that Evelyn disappeared and his kind of suspicious behavior that night, including allegedly fleeing her room. But the defense were real quick to point out that these testimonies, for lack of a better term, were kind of foggy on the details. I mean, it had been 15 years since Evelyn had been murdered, and most, if not all, of these witnesses had been drinking the night that she disappeared. But also, there was this huge unspoken cultural barrier in the courtroom where the jury, who were all white, by the way, didn't really understand the subtle gestures and nuances in communication of the Aboriginal witnesses. According to a report by Dr. Diana Eads from the University of New England, who travelled to BOWRAVILLE in 2005 and then attended the trial in 2006, the witnesses' long pauses and lack of eye contact, while very common in Aboriginal communities, communities could have been interpreted by the jury as evasiveness. A lot of the jurors were also confused when the witnesses would seemingly contradict themselves by first responding to a question with yes, and then going on to answer the question in the negative. So this is called gratuitous concurrence. And back in the 90s, original investigators had also been confused when interviewing witnesses. And it's a common social response used by Aboriginal English speakers that's actually very polite. It's meant to placate the person asking the questions and make them feel comfortable. Literally all of this confusion could have been avoided by the jury receiving any kind of formal preparation on how to better understand the Indigenous witnesses, rather than the super helpful heads up from the judge at the start of the trial who told them that the Aboriginal witnesses might, quote, have some problems in terms of understanding or expressing themselves, unquote. One of the testimonies that seemed to go over a lot better with the jury was from the sweet shop lady who claimed that she had seen Evelyn in her shop the morning after she was supposed to have disappeared. And there were 4 young boys that the shop owner confirmed had been with Evelyn that morning, and all 4 of these boys also confirmed that they had been with Evelyn in the sweet shop. However, during the reinvestigation by the strike force, it was confirmed with the children's home that all of these 4 boys had lived in that none of them had been in Bowraville on that day. And the other witnesses that had also placed Evelyn in town that morning all also told the strike force that now they weren't so sure that it had been Evelyn that they had seen, or they also found that they hadn't been on Bowraville on the morning in question. But the sweet shop lady stuck to her story. She was adamant that it had been Evelyn in her shop on that morning, and Jay's defense lawyer told the jury to treat her testimony as a beacon of light to guide their decision-making process. And when the jailhouse informant witness X told his story about Jay telling him that he had gotten angry at Evelyn and banged her head against the wall, the defense lawyer asked why the jury should believe him when he had lied to other juries before. And I couldn't find anything substantial about whether or not this was true, but it is worth noting that this informant had nothing to gain from giving this testimony. Like, he wasn't given a deal for a larger sentence or anything like that. Plus, there were the other 4 jailhouse informants that the jury weren't allowed to hear from that all also said that Jay had confessed to them. Like, that's a lot of jailhouse informants. And there was another man that testified that had actually previously been a friend of Jay's, and he told the jury that one night while he and Jay were drinking and were quite intoxicated, Jay told him that he had a couple of bodies up by his marijuana patch along Congarini Road, which would line up with where Evelyn and Clinton's bodies had been found. Jay's lawyer dismissed this witness to the jury, though, basically saying that he was an alcoholic who couldn't be trusted and took too long to come forward. Jay himself did not testify at this trial, under instruction from his defense team that there was no need for it, and they were right. It took the jury less than a day to deliberate before, on the 3rd of March 2006, they found Jay not guilty of the murder of Evelyn Greenup. And this verdict really should have been the end of the road for the families of Colleen, Evelyn, and Clinton. Jay Hart had now been acquitted not once but twice in a court of law, and the chances of him ever being tried for Colleen's murder without a body were just nil. And so the families were told to move on, that if they were still struggling with their loss, then maybe they should look into grief counselling. Even their biggest advocate up until this point, Detective Gary Jubilin, told them that this trial had kind of been their last throw of the dice, that there was nowhere to go from here. But these amazing, incredibly strong families were not done. As far as they were concerned, they knew who had murdered their children, and they refused to let this man go free and not be brought to justice. And so they set their eyes on literally changing the law itself, specifically the laws surrounding double jeopardy in New South Wales. And I mean, this wasn't these families wanting to just like dot an I or cross a T on some obsolete law. These laws, double jeopardy laws, are quite literally a fundamental cornerstone in most law systems in the world and have been for like 800 plus years. This was unheard of. For those of you that are unaware and never saw the Ashley Judd film Double Jeopardy, in which case What are you doing with your life? The double jeopardy rule says that a person cannot be tried again for a crime once they have been found innocent. And it exists to ensure that once an individual has received a valid acquittal, then they can't be unfairly harassed and hounded and repeatedly prosecuted for that same crime until police get a conviction, which seems fair enough. But the unspoken assumption when this rule was made 800 odd years ago was that law enforcement and the legal system in general would just be like relentlessly pursuing justice. And we needed to make sure that no one could pursue justice too vigorously and target an innocent individual until they managed to get them behind bars. And here there's a certain irony where the exact opposite had occurred. Like these victims and their families had been failed so profoundly by the system, like the majority of those in law enforcement and the legal system had done very little which even looked like pursuing justice, at least early on. And now this rule was all that was standing between these families and getting any justice at all. And so from pretty much the moment Jay Hart was acquitted of Evelyn's murder, these families campaigned and demonstrated and protested. They spoke with politicians, they spoke with the media, they marched out the front of Parliament House, calling for changes to be made to the New South Wales double jeopardy laws. And they actually succeeded. In December 2006, legislative changes heavily influenced by the murders of Colleen, Evelyn, and Clinton were introduced to the Crimes and Appeal Review Act of 2001, allowing the New South Wales Court of Criminal Appeal to order an acquitted person to be retried if there is fresh and compelling evidence against them. And this was, of course, just amazing news for the families. They were overjoyed because now the Court of Criminal Appeal could order for Jay to be retried for the murders. But from this huge and unimaginable victory has followed a very long and drawn-out battle of navigating some very messy, confusing, convoluted red tape. And it's a battle that's been filled with as many moments of hope and triumph as it has been with devastating losses. Following the changes to the double jeopardy laws in 2006, the strike force that had been in charge of the reinvestigation compiled a submission to the DPP with what they deemed to be fresh and compelling evidence against Jay. But months later, they received a one-page response from the DPP stating that the evidence was not fresh and compelling enough, in their opinion, to warrant an application for a retrial. Even the Norco Corner evidence, where the drivers said that they had seen a young Indigenous male lying in the middle of the road, and one of the drivers had said that the man standing over this boy had been Jay Hart, the DPP said that, yeah, sure, the evidence is fresh because it had never been heard in court, but in his opinion, it wasn't compelling. Still undeterred, the families, with the help of independent legal counsel, made two separate requests to two separate attorney generals asking them to apply for a retrial, but both of these requests were refused, first in 2010 and then in 2013, with the 2013 refusal basically coming down to arguments about what the legal jargon surrounding the term fresh and compelling evidence even meant. In 2014, there was a New South Wales parliamentary inquiry held at Parliament House in Sydney, which was another massive triumph for the families because no one ever thought that that would happen. At the inquiry, about 30 of the victims' family members were joined in presenting their case for a retrial to the Committee for Law and Justice by Detective Gary Jubilan and other members of the government and community that had also joined their cause as well. So the committee were able to hear the families' testimonies about their devastating losses and grief and their fight for justice, which had gone on for over 20 years by now. Also information surrounding the original investigation and the reinvestigation and the two trials and the changes to double jeopardy laws. Like, it was a lot. And so the committee definitely had some stuff to say in their final report in November 2014. First and foremost, they found that the families had been failed by the system and that the original investigation had been flawed. They also called for the New South Wales Police to review and update their policies and programs relating to Aboriginal people where necessary to ensure best cultural practices, further stating that lawyers and judicial staff in the New South Wales Department of Justice should also be required to take part in this training. And when it came to the murders of Colleen, Evelyn, and Clinton, the committee agreed with what the families had been saying this entire time, that evidence from all three cases needed to be heard at the same time in the same court of law. The New South Wales government was given 6 months to respond to and act on the committee's recommendations, but the final decision of whether all three cases should finally be heard at the same time in the same court came down to the New South Wales Court of Criminal Appeal. And in May 2016, the first application for a retrial under the new double jeopardy laws was made by the then New South Wales Attorney General Gabrielle Upton, who decided that it was in the public's best interest as well as the interest of the victims' families that there be no further delay in bringing the matter to court. And so there was a hearing held in November 2017 at the Criminal Court of Appeals, where it was actually evidence surrounding Colleen's case that was submitted as fresh and compelling evidence against Jay Hart, because after nearly 30 years, evidence surrounding Colleen's murder had never even once been heard in a court of law. And that's when we come back to the argument of what even is fresh and compelling evidence? Because Jay's defense team responded by saying, well, yes, evidence in Colleen's case hadn't been heard before, but it could have been heard before, even though it was ruled that it was inadmissible in both trials. But either way, as far as they were concerned, the evidence wasn't fresh. Following this 6-day hearing, the Criminal Court of Appeal took almost a year to hand down its unanimous decision in September 2018 that the application for Jay Hart to be tried for all three murders in one trial had been dismissed. This was another huge dead end in the road for the families, similar to when Jay had been acquitted of Evelyn's murder. There was nowhere for them to go from here, and they were devastated and heartbroken and angry. And then, for the first time in Australian history, the New South Wales Attorney General made an application to the High Court for special leave to appeal the Criminal Court of Appeal's decision to dismiss the application for a retrial, straight up challenging their decision. This was a massive deal. However, the High Court did end up upholding the Criminal Court of Appeal's decision. In 2019, Greens MP David Shoebridge, who has also been a huge advocate for their families in their fight for justice, lobbied for changes to be made to the double jeopardy laws once again to make it easier for Jay Hart to be retried for the murders. And I don't think he's been the only one to do this, but there seems to be this fear of opening the floodgates, so to speak, where the people making these decisions are terrified of the outcome there may be on other cases if they make the changes needed to see people like Jay Hart retried in a court of law. Speaking of Jay Hart is no longer Jay Hart, and he is no longer living in Bowraville. These days, Jay is living under an assumed name in another undisclosed small town in New South Wales, and according to Jay himself, he is, and I quote, as much a victim of this as the families are. It's ruined my life. It's ruined everyone's life around me. Unquote. Jay said that he has been the victim of a stubborn cop, aka Gary Jubelin, and Jay feels like he's been the victim of a poor investigation for decades. And honestly, if he is innocent, I agree with him. In an interview with Dan Box on the podcast Bowraville, Jay even said that there is a small part of him that wishes that evidence from all three cases could be heard in the same trial so that he could once and for all be proven innocent. But he worries about the legal costs and the impact that this would have on his family. To give you a little update on Detective Sergeant Gary Jubelin is no longer a detective. After 34 years on the job, Gary Jubelin retired from the New South Wales police in 2019 under immense controversy, facing multiple charges of criminal misconduct, and he was later found guilty of illegally recording a conversation with a person of interest in the William Tyrrell case. But there is speculation that Gary may have put a target on his back when he openly and publicly admitted that racism played a huge part in how poorly the original investigation into the BOWRAVILLE murders was carried out. To quote Gary Jublin in the 2014 inquiry, "Unless you have a full understanding of what the families and community have had to endure over the last 22 years, it is difficult to have an appreciation of their suffering. I have observed their pain since 1997, and it is very sad and raw. They have had to deal with the brutal murders of their children, Colleen, Evelyn, and Clinton. 3 kids from the same community, living in the same street, murdered over a 5-month period, and no one has been called into account. These matters should have been solved. They have even had to suffer the indignity of being judged on their lifestyles, a lot of which is based on ignorance and lack of understanding. It needs to be recognized that the person who murdered these children is a predator who targeted a vulnerable community and assisted in creating an environment in which these crimes could occur. The children and the families are the victims." Speaking of the victims, if Colleen and Clinton were still alive today, they would each be in their late 40s, and Evelyn would be 36. They probably would have had children of their own, families of their own, that their families still here today will now never meet and love and see grow. Colleen might have become the teacher that she aspired to be. Clinton might have gone into sports or performing arts. Evelyn never really even got the chance to dream about what she wanted to do with her life and her future because it was all cruelly snatched away. And now she is forever 4 years old, and Colleen and Clinton are forever just 16, filled with potential that they never had the chance to fulfill. Their killer probably got the chance to do all of this. Their killer probably has kids and a family and friends and a home and a job, and they've never been brought to justice for taking all of that away from Colleen, Evelyn, and Clinton. The victims' families have still not given up their fight for justice, and they refuse for their children to be swept under the rug and forgotten about. Just this year, there were signs put up in BOWRAVILLE with the pictures of all 3 children, along with the words, "Say their name." A lot of the family members have suspected for a long time that there are people in BOWRAVILLE, people within the community that know more, but haven't come forward for whatever reason. And now, as memories fade over the years and witnesses are getting older or potentially dying, it only gets more and more urgent for anyone with information to come forward. With the laws as they are right now, the only chance that the families have at justice is if fresh and compelling evidence can be presented in court. As of February this year, there is currently a $1 million reward for information regarding each of the murders of Colleen Walker-Craig, Evelyn Greenup, and Clinton Speedy-Duroux, so a $3 million reward in total. Anyone with information is encouraged to call Crime Stoppers. I'll have the number on the screen now. You can remain anonymous. It doesn't matter how long it's been, why you haven't come forward, or if the information you have, you don't think it's going to make a difference. There's a chance that it's the fresh and compelling evidence that the families have been waiting for. But that is where this case stands as of today, and I am dying to know your guys' thoughts. Thank you so much for sticking it out with me during this series. I am still processing all of the emotions. I feel like I will be for a long time. If you live in Australia, please spread word of this case, be it on social media or with your friends or family, because it is so frustrating how little spotlight this case has received when it deserves so much more. If you're not already subscribed on YouTube or following me on Spotify, depending on your platform preferences, then I would so love if you did that so that you and me can be best friends for life forever and ever and ever. Amen. Also, the hugest shout out to my wonderful, amazing patrons who are so lovely and patient with me. Thank you so much for having my back when YouTube sometimes doesn't. Hey, did you come to say bye? Thank you so much for spending this time with me and Lily. We appreciate it so much. Please stay safe and happy, and me and Lily will be counting down the hours until we see you in the next one. Bye.